Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, October 24th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the battleground state of Michigan getting a whole new set of new polls out of the state showing Kamala Harris expanding from where she was before of a minor lead across the state now to the most recent poll from Michigan State University showing Kamala Harris with roughly a 4.6%, 4.7% lead across the battleground state. Now, this comes really at a time where the Democratic Party has been looking across the nation for some good news in the battleground states. Where can they see an expansion? Where are they starting to see a reversal in trend lines here, where Donald Trump seems to have been consistently gaining on the vice president over the past 2 weeks across the nation, whether that be nationally, on a statewide level? All of these things have become more worrisome for the Democratic Party, and these new Michigan numbers can sort of put Democrats somewhat at ease in this battleground state, that they are still absolutely holding on to being in the advantage in the state, and very clearly know that the race is still very much up in the air, but equally too, they know that this race looks a lot better for them than it did 2 weeks ago, even if the vibes of the race have shifted quite in favor of the former president. And this first started when there were some new numbers out of Bloomberg and Morning Consult. That showed Michigan in a position where Kamala Harris held a 2-point lead against the former president. Now, the Real Clear Politics average has Donald Trump up. The 538 average has Kamala Harris up. The 538 forecast has Kamala Harris up. And these recent numbers, despite now being released into the public, some of them have not even been included on the Real Clear Politics average here. But generally speaking, the consensus is that Kamala Harris maintains a minor advantage in the state. And Michigan has not always been the state that has had massive polling errors. The largest we saw was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was predicted to win the state by 3.4%, ultimately lost it by 0.3%, a swing year of roughly 3.7, which is largely in line with the margin of error that ranges between 3 to 4 points. Back in 2020, very similar thing happened. Biden was up 4.2% on Real Clear Politics. He ended up winning by 2.8%, and it has been very much back and forth when it comes down to this race, and Democrats certainly aren't doing as well as Biden did, but keep in mind Biden had some room to fall in some of these battleground states. After all, he did win Michigan by 3 points, and you really only need to win a state by a plurality or by any margin in order to win all of its electoral votes. And like I said, Bloomberg Morning Consult, the Michigan State University poll, some other data points too that we've been seeing. Quinnipiac University just released a data point just a few days ago showing Kamala Harris with a 3-point lead in the state of Michigan. All around here, we're starting to see some more favorable numbers in the state that do in fact say, hey, wait a minute. Kamala Harris is actually in a position, sorry about that, my alarm just wanted to yell at me for a moment, but it is in a position where she is doing actually better than many people, would have you think based on the things you're seeing on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok. This race obviously is still competitive, and it absolutely is in no person's column 100% guaranteed. And so I really do reject, traditionally speaking, any and all notion that some race is going to be completely lopsided in one direction, and I think these polls really do combat that. What I think they also do is provide a bit of light onto the state of Michigan as a state that hasn't been polled as frequently as some of the other battlegrounds and honestly isn't discussed as frequently, despite it being seemingly a very competitive state. When it comes down to how it voted in previous elections, Donald Trump won it in 2016, Joe Biden won it in 2020. This state goes back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, and Kamala Harris knows that. That's why they're investing over $100 million in the state for the 2024 cycle. That's why in 2020, they invested over $100 million in the state. Hillary Clinton also invested money likewise in 2016. It wasn't one of those states that she entirely neglected. Wisconsin, I would say, really does fit into that category, but Michigan and Pennsylvania, not so much. It was more of the fact that Donald Trump did, in fact, make improvements in the Rust Belt relative to what George W. Bush was able to do, to John McCain was able to do, Mitt Romney was able to do, even with his running mate hailing from the state of Wisconsin. And looking at what these numbers tell us for the sake of an electoral college map, well, they all point in one direction. That Kamala Harris holds a narrow advantage in the state of Michigan, enough that it actually might translate her to winning in that battleground state. And so to set the scene for what it means if Michigan does go blue, it makes the pathway forward for Donald Trump a bit trickier as to how he wins the election. It's still very much possible. But what we also know about the Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, is they vote together. Very rarely have they ever broken apart, and the last time they did break apart, meaning they didn't vote in sequences of all together, was in 1988. What happened then? Well, in these 3 states, they broke up. George H.W. Bush won some states, lost others. But then in 1992, and then 1996, and then 2000, and 2004, and 2008, and 2012, and 2016, and 2020, they all voted together for 24 plus years consistently. That's good for the Democratic Party, assuming Michigan is a general indicator of how some other states might go. And granted, the numbers in Michigan don't always translate to amazing numbers for Kamala Harris in states like Wisconsin, but a tied result is better than what, again, the Republican Party and the mainstream press has been pushing, is that Donald Trump is winning every battleground state. Very clearly, that is not the case. And I think we need to learn a bit from the 2022 midterms that sometimes the polls aren't always fully accurate. I think we learned that in 2020, but the narrative has really been lost in the fact that maybe we're underestimating some levels of Democratic support in some battleground states to a point that might serve to our detriment in our general sets of analysis and really just, understanding where we are in the election and what the election might actually look like. 241 to 219 means that Kamala Harris also has additional pathways to the presidency because Michigan has given her 15 electoral votes that boosts her forward, right? Boosts her to 241. She's no longer at that number, 226, which is where she was before. 241 from 226. That's good for the Democratic Party. But they obviously have room to work, right? They have, they need to grow in order to win the election. You can't win with 241 electoral votes. But again, Michigan provides an easy opportunity for that, assuming that voters who are being contacted in Michigan, appealed to in Michigan, inspired to vote in Michigan. You can even see Democrats across the country are just as inspired and find Kamala Harris to be as popular amongst the base as Obama was in 2008. That has not been matched since that year's election, not even in 2020. That's good for Kamala Harris. But again, it gives her options. It gives her options as to how she reaches the magic number of 270 electoral votes. You win Michigan but lose Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, you still can win the election. Go through the Sun Belt strategy. Win the state that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden did, like Nevada. Win Arizona with the abortion referendum on the ballot. And then win either Georgia or North Carolina. She's been polling better in Georgia recently as of late. And so you can see Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan would be enough to put Kamala Harris over 270, which means even if she loses Florida, Texas, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania would really be a shocker here. We're just assuming, let's say it goes red. Kamala Harris still has a pathway forward, and she could even lose North Carolina in that circumstance. And let's say she wins Pennsylvania. What does that mean for some other states? Well, now she can afford to lose North Carolina. Now she can afford to lose Georgia, and she still wins the election. And while I know this seems impractical, that an electoral map like this would never arise, weirder things have happened in American politics. And in this cycle, assuming Michigan goes to the Democratic Party, that could be really good news for them on election night. The Michigan Secretary of State announced that they expect to count all ballots by end of day Wednesday. That's good for the party. Not for the party, that's good in understanding how the race is going to go, because Michigan can be a general indicator, again, of Wisconsin, of Pennsylvania, and arguably even many other battleground states. I think Kamala Harris should be happy to see some data points like this that show Kamala Harris leading in Michigan, and in a way, in the majority in some of these polls. But in some of them, too, reminding her that she's not in the majority just yet on average, right? When you take a look at what's expected of her in 538, even though she has a 55% chance of winning the electoral votes in Michigan, she's only barely at that majority mark, 50.3 to 49.7. And granted, it has swung back and forth. It was 50 to 50 the other day. It's slightly expanded in favor of Kamala Harris, but she did get from a point where one end she was up 3 points statewide to being up less than a point today because the numbers aren't as good for her as they once were. But the data points are starting to return in a way that are getting to be even better for her. Bloomberg and Morning Consult, Harris +3. Quinnipiac University, Harris +3. And now Michigan State University, which isn't the gold standard for polling in Michigan, but is a B+ poll, which I'd argue is even, a bit solid in the state. Kamala Harris leading in this battleground state is absolutely news. Because also, too, what we saw was that the Donald Trump team started pulling some ad funding from the state of Michigan. Now, I'm not going to say they're giving up Michigan by any means. Donald Trump will be in Michigan over the next 2 weeks. They'll be investing heavily into the state of Michigan. We're likely not going to see what we saw in 2020, which was this withdrawal of advertisements, of funds, of field offices in some battleground states that were early indicators like, wait a minute, maybe Donald Trump isn't going to be as competitive in X state as he once was. A good example of that would be a state like Colorado, for instance, or in a state like Virginia, where Donald Trump had field offices in Colorado in 2016 and 2020, made an intentional get out the vote effort in these battleground states. But as they got closer to election day, especially in 2020, as they started to realize they'd be losing some of these battlegrounds, then they started to say, wait a minute, pull the funding, spend it elsewhere. Pull the funding, spend it elsewhere. And while we're not seeing a complete removal of advertisements by any means or field offices by any means in Michigan, we are seeing some levels of withdrawal, and it means that extra amounts of spending probably is being reallocated elsewhere. Why? Maybe some of the internals show Kamala Harris in a pretty okay position in the state of Michigan, because 2 weeks out from the election is when polls really start to get more accurate. We're starting to get to a point where we're reaching the final polls of the election cycle. The most recent poll from Pennsylvania, the final one from Franklin and Marshall, they said that Donald Trump led by 1 point amongst likely voters in their final poll, amongst registered voters by 4 points. Huge change. Based on the regular voter screen, likely voter screen, I don't know how much I buy it. I can honestly see, too, that polling institutes sometimes really do publish both their likely voter and registered voter numbers and find them to be in really contrasting ways. A big reason for that is because they can hedge their bets. So whoever wins the election, they can say our likely voter screen was 100% accurate. Our registered voter screen was 100% accurate. So it really can go either direction. But I think that also speaks to the range at which we could see Harris win by 1, 2, 3 points. Donald Trump, if he was to win Pennsylvania, will likely do so by maybe 1 or 2 points at most. Michigan, same thing. Kamala Harris is in a good position in Michigan. There's no denying that. Does it mean she would be guaranteed to win it? The answer is absolutely not. They still need to fight for it. Every single voter matters in Michigan. Every single thing from here on out is going to change the trajectory of the election. And I wouldn't be shocked if the polls weren't able to capture a last-minute shift in some of these states as they are getting to their final stages of polls of the cycle, because it costs a lot of money to field them. Voters start voting already and start, changing some of the responses. Don't give accurate information. And also just sometimes these institutes only do polls once or twice a cycle. In most cases, that poll is either concluded or is happening right now and will be done in roughly a few days. And so I think as we get further and further down this finish line, as we get closer rather to the finish line for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, we start to realize that some states are going to start moving away from each other. States like Wisconsin and Michigan might move in opposite directions, even if the standard history convention would say that they are voting together. And honestly, maybe not. The way these elections typically end is that there is a consolidation of support in some of the battlegrounds. Races start tightening, voters start becoming much more okay and assured of who they're voting for. A recent national poll today showed that 18% of voters are still up in the air as to who they're going to vote for between now and Election Day. That's a lot. That is a lot, given we are 2 weeks out. But typically, it's less than that. And typically, voters have already made a clear decision as to how they're going to vote, whether that's early vote by mail. Democrats are really lagging behind in some battleground states in the early vote and the vote by mail. But we're also starting to see some new data points that say a lot of Democrats are voting on Election Day. But the numbers earlier on out don't look too promising for Democrats. But what's to say they haven't changed the way they approach voting? I also think, too, some of the data points out of states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada are really just a mixed bag bunch, right? Some things show good news for Democrats, some things show good news for Republicans. And while there is some merit in understanding, the massive outreach and the massive voter turnout in some of these states and all these different things that in theory can benefit Democrats or Republicans, sometimes hyper-focusing on the early vote can serve to your detriment. So I'm really trying to shy away from spending too much time talking about it, too much time analyzing it, because at the end of the day, the only poll that matters is on Election Day. And so, leaving us on a note here, I think Michigan is a state that certainly walked away from President Biden quite heavily, especially relative to where he was, back in 2020. Michigan was a complete crap show for Joe Biden when he was running against Trump, down 2.1%. And the last poll that was conducted was the Detroit Free Press that showed Donald Trump with a 7-point lead across the state, a massive, massive improvement for the former president in this state. I think the last time we saw I don't even know if Detroit News released their new data in this poll, but I'm sure they will find one that is really interesting between the candidates here. Although Real Clear Politics has Donald Trump up in the average, they have yet to consider the Michigan State University poll, and I do think this is pretty substantial. This is nearly a 5-point lead across the state. Combined with what we saw was that 3-point lead in Michigan. We saw it with, I guess completely messed up here in Morning Consult and Emerson. I mean, all these different things, Quinnipiac, Michigan State University. TLDR, the numbers are getting better for Kamala Harris in Michigan, and that applies a lot to an electoral map where every single vote matters. Should Kamala Harris win Michigan, I'd honestly bet that she's winning Pennsylvania and potentially with it the presidency as she goes across the electoral map and wins individual swing states that get her closer and closer to 270 until she absolutely crosses it. No guarantee that she wins Michigan at this point. It's obviously more likely than not, but I will say this. Michigan has been a tricky one for Kamala Harris. I wouldn't even be shocked if Michigan vote is the right of Pennsylvania. But as of right now, the numbers are telling us that Kamala Harris is doing a lot better in Michigan than she was before. And some very reputable sources, as they enter into the final stages of polling and understanding the race, are saying Kamala Harris is starting to win back support. If there was ever a time for Kamala Harris to turn around a race, turn around some of these battlegrounds, that time would be now. And maybe Michigan is the first start of how we are going to see it continue across some other battleground states. or honestly, maybe not. This race is truly a toss-up. Every state's deciding to go in one direction or the other. And the question remains, will Michigan hold blue as the polls are predicting? Or will it be a 2016 type of error where they end up going to Donald Trump despite the preliminary data suggesting otherwise? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.